Start your day with It's the Business.
Here's Phil Dobbie.
Well, today it's the day Boris tells us that we can come out of the basement and start mixing with real people again. But how quickly? Well, the fast rollout of the vaccine program is certainly helping to speed things up.
And then all adults should be offered a jab by the end of July.
So long as we don't echo the mistakes of the past and ease things too quickly. But look, there's one part of the world where vaccines aren't necessarily good news.
It's now a time for optimism and hope for the future.
Yeah, boo to optimism and hope for the future. Any idea where that is? Stay tuned. Plus, house prices. Will they really bounce back more than they have already?
We in the UK, we have this very weird culture of home ownership. We're obsessed by it. You know, it's dinner party conversation.
Not that we are having any dinner parties at the moment, but maybe the prospect of dinner parties will mean we've got to buy new houses. So we've got something to talk about. Russell Quirk is one real estate expert talking things up for the industry. Many of his compatriots are going the opposite way, talking it down. But if you've got the spare cash right now, interest rates are low, inflation seems like it might pick up sometime soon. It's hard to see what else you're going to spend your money on, isn't it? All that and more for Monday, the 22nd of February, 2021. Good morning.
And now, it's The Business, making sense of it all with Phil Dobbie.
Now, if you step outside this morning, and hopefully you will, because it's a beautiful day, you will notice that the birds are singing again. Yes, birdsong is back. We heard it over the weekend, of course, well, you know, for a few days now, because we're on our way to spring. The birds, no COVID-19 for them. They're going to sing us into spring with the warmer weather at long last. There's a lot to be optimistic about. And then today, Boris Johnson's going to tell us when we can go out and play again. And hopefully it's not going to take too long, but similarly, hopefully it's not going to be too quick either. We want to make sure we do it right this time. So we've got lots to be optimistic about. And in amongst all this enthusiasm, are we going to start buying bigger houses? Russell Quirk. Well, maybe not bigger houses. Maybe we're just going to make them more expensive, in which case nobody wins. But Russell Quirk is one real estate agent who is saying that things are going to get better this year in terms of house prices. And I can sort of see his way. He's our special guest on the program this morning. Now, things are warming up in Dallas today. I think it's 22 degrees there today. A 6 was their overnight low after days and days of sub-zero temperatures. But it's warming up there now. But of course, they are left with the broken pipes that have frozen and then burst. Water shortages. People relying on food banks for support to survive. I mean, there's horrific tales that people were burning furniture, so they haven't got much furniture. There's going to be a furniture boom in Texas now. I hope they've got an IKEA there. So a big demand for Allen keys about to happen there. Now, later on this week, we're going to look at what's gone wrong in Texas with their energy supplies and ask whether this is an example of privatizing geographic monopolies that can go wrong, like energy provision. Is it a good idea to do that, particularly when things do go wrong and people do have to burn their furniture to stay warm, when the federal government is called to bail them out because people have been hit by ludicrous energy bills, because energy bills are charging a mozza when demand so outstrips supply. Isn't this an example of complete market failure? Here's Republican Senator Michael McCall from Texas on CNN saying it's all just because Texas hasn't been, and here's a word, winterized.
Well, you know, here's the deal is that because we were not winterized, I mean, and it is a paradox, right? Here you have Texas, probably the energy capital of the world, right. I would say, Houston and Texas in general. We have more energy in this state than any other state in the United States, and arguably more than any in the world. And yet here we are without energy. How does that make sense? And we can blame it on wind and solar, but that's about 25% of the grid. 75% is natural gas and coal. They were all frozen in their operations. So this winterization idea that I talked about that was set forth in the 2011 report is something that I believe we need to strongly move forward and make the investment that they failed to do in the past. Yeah, I mean, we're going to have to make that investment now.
So let's just call it winterization because we don't want to use those words, climate change. But they certainly weren't prepared. I mean, these stories about wind farms being frozen, really? I mean, you know, they seem to manage to provide wind energy in Norway and Sweden, where it gets much colder than it has been in Dallas. But the whole thing costing a fortune for many people in Texas. There's one 63-year-old in Dallas got an electricity bill for $17,000, 7 times what he'd normally pay. That's the way the free market energy system works there. Underdeveloped and overpriced. So we're going to look at that later on in the week. But for those in Texas, well, it would have been cheaper to go to Cancun, wouldn't it? And maybe they should have followed Ted Cruz over there, because it's a lot cheaper to take a holiday in Texas than it would to pay for keeping the power on at home. Also tomorrow, more on the Uber story. That was big news over the weekend. Here's the reaction from some Uber workers on Friday. Also tomorrow, more on the Uber story. That was big news over the weekend, wasn't it? Here's the reaction from some Uber workers on Friday, hearing the news that they would now be classified as workers. So they're going to get holiday pay, sick pay, and their national insurance contributions. All good news for them. So this is ITV News, watching some of those Uber drivers hearing the news on Friday.
The Supreme Court unanimously dismisses Uber's appeal. Whether or not an individual is a worker.
All very happy about it now until they find they've got a job tomorrow. Well, we'll find out, won't we? I mean, is it good news or bad news? And what are the repercussions of all of that? We'll talk about that tomorrow morning on the programme. But does this also mean that if they are working, I mean, now they'll have to presumably work set times. I mean, if Uber is told that you have to treat them as employees, they're going to say, well, okay, this is when you work. This is when we need drivers on the road. You haven't got a choice on this now. Are you going to have to work a minimum number of hours per week? And how much of a precedent has been set by this? We'll have more on that tomorrow on the programme. Now, great day for the pound on Friday. Well, great if you want the pound to be high. I make most of my money overseas, so I actually like a very weak pound. But, and you'll appreciate it when you go on holiday as well, if we've got a very strong pound. But obviously, if you're trying to sell stuff overseas, not such good news. But a chunk of this strength is almost certainly because of the vaccine news in the UK and the expedited schedule from Boris Johnson and Matt Hancock. Here's Matt Hancock speaking on Sophie Ridge yesterday.
We're now aiming to offer a vaccine to everybody in categories 1 to 9. That's those who are most vulnerable, and the over 50s and health and social care workers. And to do that by the 15th of April. And then all adults should be offered a jab by the end of July. We now think that we have the supplies to be able to do that. We can see that the NHS and all of those partners and all those working on this have been able to deliver jabs at about 500,000 a day, which is an incredible effort.
It is amazing, isn't it? Just how quickly this is being rolled out. And they are also, on the sly, vaccinating teachers. My next-door neighbour was told she could go to a mass vaccination centre during the school holidays a few days ago. She did turn up after a half-hour, 45-minute drive to find out that they'd actually run out of the vaccine. So they've stuffed it up, but at least they're trying to do something to get teachers vaccinated, although they are not publicly promoting it, which is a bit strange. In fact, there was a BBC report earlier in February saying that teachers had been sent booking links for jabs, even though they're not in priority groups. So it sounds like they've been trying to do it in a haphazard fashion. Surely, Labour are right on this. Surely it would have made sense to use the half-term holidays to get through as many teachers as possible and delay some of the other groups. I would be happy to have my jab delayed if it meant teachers were going to get vaccinated in readiness for kids going back to school, which is the intention, we are told. So happy days. The vaccine's getting rolled out. The kids are going back to school. Boris Johnson will tell us how quickly the lockdown measures will ease sometime today, this afternoon, I think. When can you hug your mother? Or anyone. We are just going to go hug crazy. So long as you don't get creepy about it, we're going to go hug crazy, aren't we? But is there a risk that he is going to pander to the backbenchers today and make it all happen too quickly? We'll have to wait and see. But also, it's going to be interesting to see what happens in Israel, because yesterday they opened shops, museums, libraries, shopping malls, all reopened on the same day because they have quite a lot of the population vaccinated now. So it'll be interesting to see what impact that has, because the infection rates aren't down to zero there just yet. So maybe it's a bit premature. Look, the front page of the Eye is predicting what Boris Johnson will say today. Outdoor sport and rule of 6 in March. All schools will reopen on the 8th of March, they reckon, including extracurricular activities. And from the 29th of March, the rule of 6 will resume outdoors. Same in The Guardian today. School sports and social contact first, as PM plans to lift lockdown, is their headline. And the Daily Mail, slow march to freedom. See what they did there? They're the only ones actually trying a pun in the headline, unusually. The Daily Telegraph, stay at home to be scrapped as Prime Minister unveils new route to normality. The Independent, families reunited by Easter as lockdown lifts. Pretty much the only story really on the front pages today. Although the Times leads with £500 for catching COVID under law to slow virus. So everyone who tests positive, they're saying, will be given the money to ensure that they self-isolate, something they reckon is going to cost £2 billion a month, although it might cost a bit less if they limited it to those who can't work from home. So we'll see. I mean, what's to stop people taking the £500 but still going to work? I don't know. But it says the present payment system has been blamed for prolonging the pandemic by forcing people who are infectious to go to work. And, we can see the evidence of that. The Apple Mobility Index, which looks at, how you're moving around with your mobile phone. The amount of driving going on Friday, just 15% less than before the pandemic. When we look at the first lockdown, it was down by almost 75%. So but you get on the roads and you're thinking, where are all these people going? We are just 15% lower than we were back in January when we knew nothing of the coronavirus. Still, it could be worse. In the United States, they're actually driving more than they were before. And they're walking a little, just a tiny bit. They're walking just a little bit. Do you know we're walking about 4 times more? We have discovered what it's like to put shoes on and walk down our road and maybe even explore the country. So maybe appreciate the country that we live in. Can you imagine? Well, we can appreciate it that little bit more now. It's not freezing and covered in snow. But the United States, they're driving more and they're still getting 70,000 new cases a day. We're getting a little over 10,000 cases a day. But Israel, from a peak of over 8,000 cases in early January, down to 3,200 right now on a 7-day moving average, which is still pretty high for them to be opening all the shops and schools and libraries. So we'll see what impact all of that has. Going to be interesting to watch. The health ministry there has said in Israel that the BioNTech Pfizer vaccine, it's 89% effective at preventing infection of any kind. So it's not just saving you, it's also stopping you spreading the virus. So that is fantastic news, isn't it? Everyone's got to be happy about the vaccine, right? Well, you would have thought so, unless you are an anti-vaxxer. So here's a crowd at the Australian Open booing the idea that vaccines are being rolled out in Australia from today.
Heartfelt challenge. It's been a time of deep loss and extraordinary sacrifice for everyone. And with vaccinations on the way, rolling out in many countries around the world, it's now a time for optimism and hope for the future.
Yeah, that is astonishing, isn't it? I mean, there were some people cheering as well, but a lot of people in the crowd apparently were refusing to wear masks as well. This hasn't been helped by the fact that Novak Djokovic, who was, the world number 1 tennis player, was playing in that final, and he is a hardened anti-vaxxer, even though he's caught COVID-19 for not socially distancing, following the rules. But there we are, whole lot of people in America booing at the idea that they're going to get the vaccines. So clearly, there's some who don't want it. Probably don't want any foreigners to come into the country and spreading it. There's a whole section of Australian society, I suggest, would like that. Meanwhile, here in the UK, we have the worst economic collapse since 1709, since the Great Frost. Rishi Sunak will be borrowing at least £450 billion this year to pay for it all. And even then, we'll be left with a massive unemployment number. The official unemployment rate is 5%, but we still have 4.4 million people on furlough. And I don't think they'll all eventually go back to work. So we could see unemployment back down to, up to, I should say, back to where it was in the Thatcher years. And this rise in unemployment has been spread across all age groups. It's everyone under 65. It's not just young people. 35 to 49-year-olds have been hit as well. And yet, in amongst all of this, house prices are rising. Well, particularly outside London. Rightmove reckon Paisley near Glasgow has seen prices rise 15% in the last year. I've checked our house on Rightmove as well. They reckon it's risen by 13%. Mind you, the average house price in Paisley, I should add, is £127,000. Can you imagine getting a house for £127,000? Not if you live in the south. So will house prices keep rising? Well, we have this big gash in the economy, don't we? We have this festering wound. But we also have low interest rates and no hint that they're going to rise anytime soon. In fact, central banks are doing the opposite, signalling that it could be years before we see rates rise. And as the central banks are buying up government bonds, the safe money is moving into riskier assets like the share market, particularly in the United States. But of course, a safer asset is housing. So I don't get why some people are forecasting that house prices are going to drop. Real estate agents and analysts and the like are saying that they will. But I am with Russell Quirk on this, real estate commentator, investor director at Keller Williams in Essex, and he runs Propaganda PR. Well, he's with us this morning. Russell, I mean, thanks for getting up. We've already seen the bounce back, haven't we? I mean, mortgage approvals have died basically in early 2020, but by November and December last year, they were the highest for well over a decade. So that is a real bounce back. We're seeing it already.
At first glance, absolutely. So the latest numbers from HM Land Registry show that across the UK as a whole, house prices increased by 8.5% in 2020. Now, nobody, apart from me actually, would have predicted that at the beginning of 2020 or certainly at the onset of the pandemic. But I think what the commentators are kind of understandably concerned about, I suppose, is that the stamp duty holiday, which has been much publicised, which may or may not be extended from March the 31st for 6 weeks, depending on what Rishi Sunak says in the budget, that becomes, in effect, a cliff edge. And, of course, if most of the transactions that were going to happen this year, last year, and pulled forward from later this year have already happened, that we will see a kind of vacuum in the property market that some say will, inverted commas, inevitably lead to falling house prices. And actually, some of the big guys that are regular pundits on the housing market are saying the following. So the Halifax says that house prices will drop between 2 and 5%. Savills and Knight Frank, two big estate agents, they say zero growth in 2021. Ernst & Young, believe it or not, are predicting a 5% fall. And some pundits are going even further. There's some outfit called Really Moving that I read about the other day saying that we're going to see a 6.3% drop in Q1 2021 alone. And but my contention...
What is the reason they're giving for this? I mean, because it can't all be stamp duty, because that is a pretty transitory thing, isn't it? I mean, if you got in there, there might be a month or two after it finishes, you could see that perhaps there'll be a bit of a lull. But I mean, it's just a point in time.
There's I think you can conflate uncertainty and potential bad news with the and again, big inverted commas here, the inevitability of house prices dropping. But if we just look back in recent history, if we look back to the beginning of 2016, when the likes of Mark Carney, the then Bank of England governor, and George Osborne, the then chancellor, both very publicly said house prices will fall by as much as 18% if we vote to leave the EU. And of course, we did vote to leave the EU. We have now done so. House prices are about 25% higher. So, those guys were very, very wrong indeed. So I think it's very easy to look at uncertainty and believe that as a consequence is negative. But I think what they forget, and it's kind of lazy for them, I guess, to predict doom and gloom in the face of such uncertainty and potential negativity. What they forget are the fundamentals. And those fundamentals are that we in the UK, we have this very weird culture of home ownership. We're obsessed by it. It's dinner party conversation. It's talked about, in the property news, in the news as property every day.
No offence, Russell, but I try and avoid those dinner parties. If the conversation is all about real estate and schools, I'm not going back to that household again. That's, maybe, but it is dinner party conversation. People want to talk about house prices and how much money they've earned on their house and, the second home that they're buying and all the rest of it. You mentioned earlier as well, borrowed money. Of course, borrowed money is ridiculously cheap, bank rate 0.1%. I mean, It could go negative. And if it goes negative, it doesn't necessarily mean that the bank are going to be throwing money at us to borrow, but it does mean that a variable mortgage rate of 2% could go to 1.5% or even 1%, which means the cost of borrowing on a mortgage is lower. The one big thing that has fueled house prices over the last 3 or 4 decades is cheap
debt, cheaper and cheaper debt. So I think that gets cheaper. So that also therefore fuels my contention that house prices will not drop this year.
No, and even if you were to say, well, that's that is setting people up to fail in a way, isn't it? Because they're buying when interest rates are low, so they get heavily into debt. Then when interest rates start to rise, then they struggle. But we now know that is going to be years and years away, and the inflation effect on those loans in those years is going to, in effect, bring down the how much you've borrowed. So we all know that the further you go through a mortgage, the value of that money is actually reduced. So but your wages have increased, so the cost of paying your mortgage improves. So if we know it's going to be a long way off, even if you have overstretched yourself, you're going to find it easier by the time interest rates rise. So I mean, these are in a way sort of halcyon days. There's if we get interest rates to stay low and inflation does pick up, well, that's actually the perfect combination.
Well, it is. And also, let's not forget what I think will be a very buoyant economy towards the end of this year. So H2 2021, I think we'll see what I would describe as a VE Day spirit, whereby, we're out of lockdown. COVID is almost entirely behind us. We have then two things. We have the £100 billion in unspent consumer cash that's sitting in bank accounts that wasn't spent over the last 12 months because of lockdown. And we also have then the sentiment, the relief, the celebration of getting out of COVID, which will mean that people go out and, certainly if I'm anything to go by, I'm going to go out and have as many meals and drinks and book as many holidays and buy as many consumer goods as I can because I can and because I've been stopped from doing so. So I think there will be, I guess we'd call it pent-up demand realised. And I think that will grow the economy in many, many respects towards the end of this year, which of course also then gives people confidence in property, bricks and mortar, whether as investors or buyers. So look, I think 2021 for the property market, rather than it being the big negative that the likes of the Halifax and Ernst & Young are saying it is, I think will be the absolute opposite. I think it will be a boom.
But the demand might be there, but what about the reaction from the banks? So that the number of loans that are over 90% of the value of the property fell quite a bit last year. In Q3, it was 3.5% of all loans. In Q3 2019, it was almost 6%. So banks obviously are saying, you've got to have more equity in the game before we can give you a loan. So could that bank's reticence slow things down a bit because they'll be worried about toxic debt through all of this?
Well, that's already changing. So if you look at the last month or two, there's now about 200 90% plus loan to value mortgage products. And you're absolutely right. During Q2, Q3, Q4 last year, there were far, far fewer high loan to value mortgage products. But the banks have already started easing that, notably HSBC. And why? Well, A, because they have to lend, because ultimately they've got to balance risk versus reward, I suppose. But also their analysts can see that there isn't the threat to the property market that perhaps they thought there was 6, 8, 9 months ago. So I think the banks will come back to the table and will start lending, maybe with some caution, of course, but not with the caution or anything like the caution that they had 5, 6, 7 months ago.
And as you say, there's all this extra cash swilling around. So actually part of the reason why there might be less 90% loans is because people can actually afford to take out an 85% loan, for example, because they've got a bit more money in the bank account. But what do you think is going to happen though? Is it going to be because remortgages have slipped quite a bit, which surprises me. I would have thought we might actually be remortgaging and getting if we can't go overseas, we might be looking at holiday homes. But but maybe that's not happening just yet. Or do you think we could see a bit of a bounce of that? People taking out a second home, maybe also investment properties for, buy to lets, or is it people moving to bigger houses? How do you see the markets moving this year?
Yeah, I think the second homes is a very interesting conversation because the data certainly shows that lots more people are thinking about buying a second home, but in the UK in particular. Yeah. And I guess kind of burned by lockdowns, not that people, I think, not the right-minded people expect there to be lockdowns during 2022, 2023, but they want an alternative base that they can, they can do a Kirsty Allsop or a kind of Gordon Ramsay and go off to their second home if they see fit to, I guess. And of course, these, which some of these celebrities have very famously and perhaps ill-advisedly done, but that they are also generally, if you buy the right second home, in terms of capital appreciation and rental yield, they can be very, very lucrative investments indeed. So, and again, it goes back to the point about cheap money. Yes, if there's a positive sentiment and a kind of a willingness or a want or a need to kind of, have another base, then yes, look, the second home market, I think, will be equally buoyant. And of course, what we'll start to then see, I suspect, is the local authorities in Cornwall areas and Norfolk areas trying to line up to try and stop these horrible second homeowners taking their properties away and depriving their next generations of places to live. And of course, we've seen that before, and I think we'll see that again. Yeah.
Well, I mean, it is an issue, of course, because it does push up prices perhaps beyond the means of the local people. I don't know how we fix that, but that has been a problem for eternity around the world, hasn't it? It's both people move to holiday areas. What about people moving out of London then? And I've been rather pleased. I bought a house a year ago, just before the pandemic. And if I believe the numbers on one website, it's gone up 13% in a year because I'm in that commuter belt into London. And I think there's a lot of people moving out. When we are hearing these figures about how much London is hollowing out, is that a temporary thing, do you think?
Well, the land registry numbers yesterday were really interesting. So they show that the Northwest is 11.5% higher in property value terms than it was this time last year, against London at just 3.5%. So for once, the regions are kind of, kicking London into the gutter, really, in terms of price performance. But I think it will be temporary, honestly. We did definitely see, again, in the stats, in the numbers, the HM Land Registry numbers show that a lot of people did move out of cities, perhaps more than normally would have done as a proportion of movers last year. But looking at what Rightmove, Zoopla and On the Market, the big property portals, are saying, they now report that the amount of inquiries that are coming into them for properties back in cities, so London, Manchester, Liverpool, Leeds, Birmingham and so on, are back up to where they were 12 months ago. So I think the exodus from cities is probably something that's somewhat short-lived. And I suppose it takes us to the whole debate around working from home and so on. I think the consensus now seems to be that it won't be binary. It won't be, people working at home entirely. Most people, me included, will want to find a balance. So, people still want to be fairly close to the city because of their occasional commute. But let's not forget, some people live in cities, London in particular, Manchester and so on, because they like living in cities. They like the convenience and the hustle and bustle and the character and the heritage and so on. So London and the regional cities are certainly not done yet.
No, absolutely. All right. What about the broader economy then? You seem to think that if we see a pickup in house prices, that's going to help the broader economy. Actually, from an economics point of view, it does, because when you borrow money from a commercial bank, you do actually expand the money supply. It's new money generated, which is pushed into the economy. So there is an economic argument to say that when we're borrowing big, the economy, well, the money supply is increasing anyway. You can argue as to what the long-term effects of that are. Some people would say it's inflationary, but we're a long way from that just now. But how do you see it helping the broader economy?
I'm certainly no economist. I'm just a humble Essex estate agent. What do I know? But,
humble Essex lad. Yeah.
Yes, but what I do see is the link between a buoyant property market and the wider economy, and I think that's proven by Rishi Sunak's endeavours in the middle of last year. The reason that he imposed the stamp duty holiday and saved people up to £15,000 on their purchase was because he understood that fueling the property market in terms of, not just transactions, but values, and that's worked clearly in the numbers. Actually, then, rather than just the economic argument in terms of money supply, it fuels sentiment. And I think sentiment is something that is really kind of undervalued in these debates. We talk a lot. I mean, economists certainly talk a lot, old economists, about, kind of economic models and so on. But what we forget is the behavioural economics, what people actually do. Yeah. And I think, when you live in a property that you bought, like you've just said, yours has gone up 13% in a 12-month period, you feel pretty good about that. So maybe you're more likely to go out and spend on carpet coverings, bathrooms and so on. You're also thinking, well, I've got a bit of equity in that thing now, so I feel quite cushioned, I suppose, as a consumer. So maybe I will invest in that new car, or maybe I will buy that telly. So I think there's a soft argument that a good property market indirectly fuels the wider economy.
Yeah, none of those things, because it's still early days, so I'm still struggling to pay the mortgage. But I take your point. At some point, I'll feel like I'm a bit wealthier. Good to talk, Russell. We'll get you on again soon. Thank you.
My pleasure. Thank you.
We're going to leave it there for now. Tomorrow, no doubt, we'll pick up on what Boris says later on today. Plus, that Uber decision. What are the broader consequences? Now the dust has settled on that. We'll look at that tomorrow morning. And later in the week, the power industry. Should we take Texas as a warning? The climate is changing. The industry needs to innovate. Can it do that whilst it lies entirely in private hands? Should we be looking at Texas and saying, we don't want to be like that? But that's it for today. See you tomorrow.
It's the Business with Phil Dobbie. Listen online at itsthebusiness or wherever good podcasts are found.